Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for our conversation today about public viewpoints. We will get started in about a minute. We'll give everyone time to join us. And hello, for those of you just joining us, we're giving everyone just a minute or two before we get started with today's conversation around Strata's latest public viewpoints data. All right. Well, good afternoon. I'm Jenna Talbot, Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisors. I've had the pleasure of supporting the team at Strata Education Network on this ongoing series. Since March, we've been surveying the American public, trying to better understand the impact of this global pandemic on their work and their education. And so we've been following that closely over the last few months. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're going to tackle a few topics. Of course, we are coming very quickly into back to school time, so we'll talk through reopening and some of the data that we've analyzed in the last few weeks. And of course, also spend time just thinking through the enduring nature of this pandemic. I think you'll see in the data that people are recognizing that the impact is going to be longer lasting than perhaps we all thought in April. And so our conversation today with three terrific leaders from the field will really be focused on how do we continue to support students as we move forward into the fall and into the new year. With that, I will happily introduce Dave in just a minute, but joining us after Dave Clayton gives an overview of the presentation and an overview of the findings will be Dr. David Andrews, who's president of National University based in California, Dr. Michael Baston, president of Rockland Community College in New York, and Dr. Kim Hunter-Reid, who is commissioner of higher education in Louisiana. So we'll jump into discussion pretty quickly here. But first, Dave, if you wouldn't mind walking us through the data, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Jenna, and my thanks as well to Dr. Kim Hunter-Reid and Dr. Andrews and Dr. Baston. We appreciate their time and look forward to their conversation with you, as Jenna indicated. This week, as we continued our survey of adult Americans that started in late March, we're 5 months into this and thinking about trends and patterns and how Americans have been experiencing the pandemic through time, as well as their expectations of education, who is looking to it at this time as a path forward. And then forecasting, what is the American public and what do current students think will take place this fall and those current students being students from all walks of life, 40% of them ages 24 and under, but 26% of them ages 25 to 34 and so on. So it's a real cross-section of individuals from all walks of life as they have their perspectives on education headed into the fall. We don't know what fall will look like and who will be where and how they'll be learning and developing skills and talents as we think about that great interest. So let's look into that a little bit. Three key questions. After 5 months, how are we weathering the storm as a nation? What is the role and status of education in the public perception at this back to school crossroads? And then what do students and public expect from education this fall? If we look at the many curves of the pandemic, Americans are increasingly expecting that the pandemic will have a long-term impact on their lives. What started out as 10, 12% believing this would impact them personally for a year or for more than a year has now become 40% of Americans expecting that. We're 5 months in, so maybe they just put a 7-month tail on it, but this growing expectation of long-term new normal, so to speak. At the same time, more than half of currently employed workers are worried about losing the jobs that they do have. So this chronic concern, you see a little dip around late May, early June, where people became a little less worried, that became elevated again. And so that's a long time for people to be uncertain about income and work opportunities as they go forward. Compounding that is a growing sense of division amongst our country. We ask this question of, is this bringing our communities closer together and making us more unified, or are we being driven apart and making us more divided? And you now see more than half of the public feeling like we're becoming more divided in our nation. And also just acknowledging the chronic sense of 40% of Americans say they feel this will have a negative impact on their mental health and well-being. So all of this gives us a feeling of where the public is through this time. And then as we look to education and how they're expecting and looking toward it, and who is seeking those benefits that they need in their lives through education and training, we get a little bit closer to that. We see overall there's an 8% increase in the number of people who say they have become more interested in enrolling in education or training because of COVID-19. We look to understand and make sense what's driving or underneath this. And we see that really it's been driven by those who have had their work disrupted by COVID-19. The workers who have not lost hours or shifts, who've not lost a job and been laid off, they've not been furloughed, they've not kept their same job but had a reduced salary. You see on the left, they're evenly split in terms of more or less likely. That overall increase comes from the 57%, so 57%, well more than half of the workers in America who are currently employed or who are seeking work report that they've had one of those disruptions in work, losing hours, income, salary, job altogether, a furlough in a different shape or form. Those are the individuals who are looking toward education with increased interest as a result of the crisis. In a challenge, even as they have increased interest, we ask those same disrupted workers who've been impacted financially and in their workplace about their interest in their perceptions of the value of education. You see on the right, 45% of them are convinced or strongly agree that more education or training would be worth the cost. 51% believe that additional education or training would help them get a good job. So they're looking to the education with significant uncertainty and division about its value and its impact as they go forward. And then perhaps also of concern is the notion that when we ask them if you can access the education or training you want, we see amongst all disrupted workers, 44% agree or strongly agree that they can have access, so not a majority. But then when we looked at that underneath and examined it by income level, we see that as even lower levels of only a third of those disrupted workers with income less than $35,000 per year in their household feel they have access to that desired education, and that then increases. So we think of people who've had their work disrupted, who are ambivalent or uncertain about the value proposition of the education that they hope for and are looking toward, and then this issue of access that is correlated with their household incomes. So in that sense of personal disruption and hopes and concern about a path forward in their lives with the work disruption, we then look at what are expectations for the fall, and what will higher education and post-secondary training look like. Just worth noting that there remains a significant portion of our population that is concerned about another wave of shutdowns as we look at this context of how predictable is the future, and that varies regionally. But within that uncertainty of work has been disrupted, then this sense of what will be happening next and a lack of clarity and confidence. Then we asked the public about a number of activities, and should they be up to an individual to choose, or whether people should be forbidden or restricted from participating in these activities. And attending college classes in person is no different in the minds of the American public than eating out at a restaurant. It has a similar 53 to 47% split. Attending a worship service, similarly. People believe you should have more individual choice if you're deciding to go to a wedding or a funeral, and even less individual choice, more likely to be forbidden to attend a large concert or a public sporting event. So this real ambivalence is consistent across our society about social gathering and physical proximity, and attending college is no different than any of those other settings for individuals as they think about what their concerns related to public health and their own health and the need for education. We asked the public about what should campuses do this fall. Should they be in person? Should they have a hybrid, some people on campus, or should it be exclusively online? Perhaps not surprising, but we see the differences between non-students, where 40% of the American public who are not currently enrolled students feel it should be an online only proposition, as opposed to just a quarter of students. You see again a plurality, a majority even of students thinking hybrid is a solution that balances their interest in in-person learning with the dimensions and the considerations of health and access around hybrid education and the online participation. The public is more skeptical than students that universities will be able to keep campuses open this fall. This notion of without interruption or needing to shut down or evacuate on campus, as so many needed to do this spring. Again, slightly over a quarter of students believe it'll be okay. The non-students, 41%, are pessimistic about that ability to succeed and go through the fall without that interruption. So if you think of disrupted workers who are looking to education, barriers to access, expectations about education and training that won't be disrupted, you start to see how this concern about predictability and planning and investing themselves in educational opportunities, there are real barriers and hurdles beyond interest and even focus, the confidence to move forward. And then we asked a question looking at a relative comparison compared to what the education that was provided in the fall of 2019 is and what will be provided in this coming fall. Again, you see a perception that the education that will be provided will be less valuable than what was available a year ago. So you have this perception and concern about the impact of the educational opportunities relative to their aspirations and hopes. I think just a few key findings that you can find and download, but just highlight the enduring nature is weighing heavily on many dimensions of our lives. Number two, the workers who have lost a job or income are driving this overall increase in Americans' interest in education. While that interest in education has increased, there remain significant concerns about value and access. The public, from a leadership perspective and understanding how communities are feeling, remain significantly concerned about in-person classes. And then students themselves are, though eager to return to campus and participate in person, have a sense that the value of that education will be less than it would have been a year ago. So thank you, Jenna.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Well, I already see some great discussion going on in the chat, but just a reminder, if you have questions for our panelists, use the Q&A function. We will certainly get to that pretty quickly here, and definitely welcome people identifying themselves when they ask their question. We've had a great community joining us over the last few months, and always love to know who's involved and who's asking the questions. But let's, of course, start with the topic of reopening. That is driving the news cycle. And in Louisiana, this is already back to school week and in the coming weeks. So let's start. I'd love to hear from each of you around what does reopening look like for your campus or in your state. Dr. Hunter-Reed, let's start with you. Your institutions are looking at a wide variety of different options and are pursuing both hybrid and online and in person. So talk us through a little bit of that, and how is the state providing guidance? How are you thinking about the next few weeks as you start reopening?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to join you. As you mentioned, it is back to school time for us here in Louisiana. So our institutions, both public and private, are back at it this week and next week. Last week, students were moving back on campus. Like my colleagues on the call, on the Zoom, and my colleagues across the country, obviously, we're looking at the science and the data. We're trying to make sure that we're addressing all of the public safety and sanitation requirements to try to minimize the spread of COVID and to maximize educational opportunities. I told Dave on yesterday, I was delighted to see that the students had more confidence than the public that we would be able to keep the doors open and do it well, because it's going to take the students and all of us being vigilant in terms of wearing masks and doing social distancing and washing hands and all of those things to keep campuses moving forward. I would say about 30%, as high of 30% of our campuses will have some in-person or that percentage of in-person class. As you mentioned, most of the classes will be online or hybrid for the students. We are certainly making sure that we walk through the guidance with our public health and emergency officials, walking hand in hand. We've been doing that for months now. We've tested our plans last week. We had emergency plans tested so they could test scenarios if we have outbreaks. So we're working really hard to make sure that the education moves forward and that it moves forward safely. We know that if you have COVID in every community across the state and across the nation, that you will have COVID on campus. So our goal is to minimize the spread, to make sure that the students are safe and faculty and staff, and that we keep the education moving forward.
Thank you. And we're going to come back to your last point around how we actually keep education moving forward. Dr. Andrews, you serve a wide number of students across California and nationally, and a lot of your students are already online, but talk to us a little bit about your reopening and what the fall will look like.
Well, that's great. Not only are we about 80% online and have been for the last 15 years or so, we're geographically distributed and we work in 1 month intervals. So we never close. So it's not a reopening for us. We had about 20% of our students who had to have face-to-face experiences. We moved those to as much virtual as we can. Those are mostly in the health professions, nursing, emergency medical technicians. We're bringing those back as quickly as the state and the counties will allow us and as is safe, but following all of the social distancing standards. And in smaller groups has been the only modification that we've had to make other than protective gear and the standard types of things. We see a major interest in our programs right now, a dramatic increase in interest in enrollments because people are struggling to find opportunities to keep up with generating credit hours. So many of those are part-time students. Our students are not a traditional 18 to 22-year-old population. Our average age undergraduate is 31 years of age. They have families, they have jobs, or they had jobs. They're looking to retool for new jobs. And the stresses that we see them having are the stresses from having a family of 4 or 5 people trying to get access to one computer and limited bandwidth and deal with childcare issues at the same time they're dealing with remote work at home issues. And we're spending more time focusing on those things and creating equitable and convenient-based access than we are trying to get people back to a physical location.
Thank you. And we'll come back to that for sure. Dr. Baston, what's it like in Rockland or at Rockland Community College?
Well, first, of course, thank you for the invitation to be with you today. When we thought about the plans we would do for our campus, we really engaged lots of stakeholders in addition to the work that we did with the state and local health authorities. We are going to have about 10% of our campus populated with students, 20% of our faculty and staff, so a 30% density on campus in total. The 90% of the students will be in virtual environments. those 10% will be those students that are in those kinds of programs that are not best assessed in the virtual environment. So the nursing and the OT, occupational therapy, the culinary, all of the other programs that really require a more hands-on orientation. So we have this mix, and we think that it both provides for the health and safety of our students, but also our employees, the entirety of our community.
And Dr. Beston, so we're seeing that workers who have lost their jobs or income due to the pandemic are more likely to enroll or to re-enroll in post-secondary education. Your institution likely will serve many New Yorkers who are looking to upskill. I've heard you talk before about the hoops we ask returning adults to jump through, whether that's particular math requirements or 16-week terms. Can you speak to some of the barriers that you foresee as people try to come back to education? And how should institutions really reset our systems to ensure that we're not perpetuating racial inequalities that we're already seeing play out with the pandemic?
Well, just think about what we're facing, and those that want to come to our colleges. They're facing three specific pandemics. Of course, there is sort of the health pandemic, and we know that the incidences that accompany that, but we're also facing an economic pandemic because of the loss of opportunities and jobs and things of that nature. And then you're thinking about the structural racism that we're trying to address, which has been most recently lifted up through so many of the protests and other ways in which people are speaking out against those structures that really limit opportunities. So you're not seeing students that are just dealing with one set of issues, but multiple issues at the same time. And so educational institutions that actually want to be a part of changing people's lives have to recognize that the system of winners and losers that currently exist has to be dismantled, and our educational systems can't actually promote those systems of winners and losers. And so you can't have people using outmoded educational determinations where you're crunching yourself into these 16-week courses, or you're crunching yourself into only the kinds of programs that don't actually lead to the kinds of opportunities that really exist in our community. That you don't limit yourself to thinking that only one type of student will be appropriate for educational opportunities. We've got to hit the reset button as our business and industry and other communities are hitting the reset button as we think about the shifts in our community.
Thank you. And I know I'm just watching the chat blow up here, so we'll come back to more of that. Related though, Dr. Andrews, you've spent a lot of time thinking about issues of cost and access. You serve a non-traditional student, although we all know in the data that is today's student. But you actually have an interesting announcement today. National is announcing that you'll be cutting tuition by as much as 25% for students. Can you speak to what prompted that decision? I know that's part of kind of an ongoing mission of access. Talk to us a little bit about that, and what have you learned about serving students who may always have some kind of access challenge as they continue to pursue their education?
Well, we are announcing a up to 25% reduction in our tuition that's made possible by scholarships that we've been able to secure from T. Denny Sanford, a very generous philanthropist, but also our reserves from over the years. We really focused on scholarships because we want these investments to benefit those who need it the most. And we also have a form of scholarship that rewards our students for making progress towards their degree. So basically, the more courses they consume, the cheaper it gets for them. But affordability is only one aspect of access. We have to personalize to the individual needs of our students in order to have an on-demand type of support that's necessary. When you talk about access, we're talking about access for working adults who have families, who now are faced with unemployment, who have childcare issues and school closure issues. And if we don't think holistically about how we deploy support for those students, we're not going to be successful. So in my mind, access includes an affordable price point, but also the convenience and flexibility of learning when you're able to find the time, the energy, and the commitment to do that. And part of our combination is a combination of asynchronous and synchronous opportunities. So we're not replacing the interaction with professors and instructors and advisors. We're deploying that efficiently to meet both the needs of the student, but also to be able to reduce the cost. And I think it's a more complex issue than just reducing the cost, but that is one of the first steps we're taking.
Great, thank you. And I suspect the audience will want to hear more about that, so we'll come back to that shortly. Dr. Hunter-Reed, in this data, we also see that a third of low-income workers say they don't have access to the education and training that they want. I know your governor's provided about $10 million in emergency funds through the Reboot Louisiana initiative to help displaced workers return to school. You've been talking to workforce boards and organizations across the state to think about how do we align the education that's available to the jobs and the needs that the state is seeing. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Absolutely. You know, when we think about education and education to employment, I think it's very important to recognize that as President Baston has said, things have changed, right? There's so much uncertainty. And so we want to make sure that individuals have access to opportunity, all individuals in our state, 1 in 5 people in poverty. So we have work to do there, erasing equity gaps and equity of opportunity, making that real for all of our citizens in our state. So as you mentioned, the governor did provide $10 million to our community and technical college system to make sure that we had high demand, high wage credentials available to scholarship individuals into those opportunities. But the challenge was with COVID, our occupational forecast was in the wind. And so you didn't have real-time information about where are the jobs and what are people looking for and hiring for at this moment in time. So I did have an opportunity to speak with the regional economic developers. The state's economic development office convened that conversation to ask, what are the top 3 jobs that you're hiring for in your area? And what kinds of credentials are needed right now to help individuals 12 weeks or less that will have real return on the investment for these dollars. And so we found the list included healthcare, no surprise there, IT, manufacturing, but it was a great opportunity for us to have that real-time conversation on the workforce side with the education side. As you know, sometimes we speak past each other, but this was an opportunity for us to really get together and say, how do we help displaced workers, 400,000 plus in the state of Louisiana? And how do we make sure that they have a meaningful pathway from education to employment? So that's the work that's underway right now in our community technical college systems. It's hard work and great work, and we're looking forward to good results there.
Great. I'm going to pose this last question before we get in to the audience Q&A to each of you. But given what Dave's presented today, and as you think about the feedback that we're hearing from consumers around what they're looking for, both those that are just returning for another school year and those that are thinking about going back, what are 1 or 2 tangible changes that our post-secondary institutions can make in response to some of this feedback? Dr. Andrews, let's start with you.
Yeah, I find it very interesting that people question the value of the education. They question how much access they're actually going to have to it, but they still want to come back. You know, so they're giving us another chance in some ways to make the changes that are necessary to be more workforce relevant, which is the one thing that I would focus on, is making sure that we understand the relevance of what we are providing in terms of a credential. And then to understand and to take those credentials and make them more valuable in a timely way. There's a question on the Q&A question already about competency-based. It is time to make learning and the value of that learning a constant, and the time you spend, the pace or the time you spend trying to learn that a variable. And right now it's the opposite. You know, time is the constant and learning is the variable. And we've been talking about this for a while, but I think the sense of urgency on retooling students to participate in the workforce is really going to force us to think about a smaller grain size in how we're offering credentials, and credentials that are intuitively valuable to the workforce. You know, we have students that need to work for 3 weeks and find a better opportunity for themselves. And we need to do a better job at micro-credentialing their acquisition of skills and knowledge so that we can put them on a pipeline to better opportunities.
Thank you. And Dr. Hunter-Reed?
So I would say, first of all, if remote learning is going to be the way we go, we obviously have got to address the digital divide in this country. We have to make sure that access to broadband is as basic as an infrastructure like lights and water. So I want to make sure that we hit that hard. And if there's any silver lining from this terrible pandemic, I hope we solve that challenge right away. In the survey data, I was struck by the fact that people see remote learning or this idea of online as not high quality, right? They question the return on investment there. And I know that in our state, we've been having faculty and staff working on professional development as part of the governor's emergency funds, trying to make sure that what we did in the spring, which was as best we could do in 2 weeks, you know, flipping a light switch from in-person to online, to a much more high quality experience for students. So I do think that there's a there when it comes to how well are we doing with remote learning, and also how do we make sure that remote learning for all really does mean that everyone has access to the tools that they need to participate fully, in addition to what Dr. Andrews talked about in terms of alignment of education to employment.
Great. And Dr. Baston?
Higher education is really good at doing and telling people what they need. Higher education is not really good at listening to what people actually need. And so it would be very helpful if we're going to be able to move forward is to actually listen instead of always starting with, we've got a way to solve your problem. I think that what we're doing most specifically is working with the Council of Industry in our community. We're working with community-based organizations within our community so that we can actually hear from those who are in business and industry what their specific needs are, to work with community-based organizations that are working with people who actually become the pool development to actually make sure that those community and the people in those communities get access to opportunities, and then really being that convener, that educational arm that allows us to actually connect the dots. But if we're just going to tell the business and industry what we think they need, we're already putting ourselves back in the old mode that doesn't work. We are in a time, based on COVID in part, that, you know, disruption is on steroids. And so we've got to understand as higher education how to move ourselves to a listening mode, to a learning mode, and actually to put us in alignment with what opportunities are going to be available to help the entirety of our community. And so it's those tangible things that we have to do, real conversations that lead to real action that even require us as institutions to actually change. What a novel concept.
Well, you're getting a lot of amens in the chat. So let's maybe stick on that for a second. I mean, I'm just looking at people's responses. This notion of listening is really important. You know, Dr. Hunter-Reed, maybe to start with you, from the state perspective, how are you thinking about, how do we ensure that we're actually listening to consumers and listening to our industry and employer partners? How do you think about that? Because it's easy to say, yes, let's listen, but then how do you actually put that into practice?
So I think that sometimes we envision things are harder than they really are, right? I think as Dr. Baston said, it's a matter of just asking, what do you need and how well are we doing producing the workers that you need and the leaders that you need to run your organizations, and having a real-time feedback loop that allows us to do that. So we were pushed to do that, more of that, because the forecasts were not there. Normally, we would rely on the forecast when we approve programs here at the Board of Regents. We'd say the occupational forecast says they need X more nurses or X more of this, so that's what we're going to do. And we count on institutions to engage. And so depending on the discipline, they may be very engaged with what the community, what the workforce is needing, but they may not be. So I think from the state perspective, it's a matter of making sure that you're talking to industry big and small and trying to understand what's the real-time need and how do you translate that to the competencies and skills that will be necessary so that people are indeed well prepared for the jobs of today and tomorrow. So I think those conversations are very important. We think about current jobs, and we also think about sort of blue ocean opportunities as economic development offices are recruiting new companies into our states. How are we at the table thinking about that work? On the other side, we are blessed at the Board of Regents to host the Council of Student Body Presidents. So I have opportunities to talk directly with our student leaders about their concerns, about what they're thinking about. And one thing that I have certainly noticed, and I'm sure my colleagues have as well, you know, if you ask someone multiple decades ago, why go to college, people would say to learn something interesting. If you ask people today, they say to get a good job. And they see us as a passport to real opportunity, tangible opportunity, social mobility. And so I think that we have to be mindful of that. We produce better leaders, people who are citizens of this world, but we also produce people who can or help people to support their vision and their dream to do great jobs and do interesting things as well.
And Dr. Andrews, I'd love to hear, you know, how are the student feedback and alumni voices, you know, playing out on your campus?
I think there's a great point of listening to both students and our other customer, which are employers. You know, and we have to listen to both of those customers and match what what employers are looking for with what students are trying to accomplish. You know, and we've discovered some just very simple things. Not many universities literally document the goal of a student upon entry and make sure that that goal is surfaced in every dashboard with any person who interacts with that student. So we have so many students that express to us why they came to us, and we give the professor a class list, or we give the advisor information on which courses they've taken and which courses they haven't taken. But we don't get back to the true value that they're aspiring to in their degree. And then on the employer side, we listen to individual employers, but we also need to take advantage of systemic ways that we're starting to track competencies across different areas of employment and match those using pretty sophisticated technology, two-sided market match technology, much like Uber and Airbnb and others do, to say, here's what's available, here's what the employers are looking for, here's what you have, and these are the gaps that we need to fill in order to make you competitive for these types of situations. So I think there's a local listening and ground up type of alignment that's necessary, but there are also emerging systems such as Burning Glass and MZ and others that are tracking what the workforce is, not LinkedIn, for example, tracking not only what they're looking for, but what they're hiring in terms of skill sets, and then taking that and deducing what students actually need in order to fill those positions. And it's going to get more and more sophisticated over the next year or two from a technology standpoint, but easier to use from a consumer standpoint, so that a student should be able to go on right now and determine what they have and where the gaps are for them achieving what they need in terms of an employment opportunity. And we need to collectively continue to put our minds together to make that a reality.
Well, this is a great follow-up question to that, perhaps for our two college presidents. You know, actually, Dr. Hunter-Reid pointed out the expectation that students have coming into college, that this is a pathway to a good job. We have a question here from Denny Meadows asking, you know, how have your campuses been thinking about your value propositions? You know, which elements have been underscored by the pandemic? Which elements require revisions? And what action are you taking? Perhaps Dr. Baston, we'll start with you.
Sure, I love that question. The reality is we're starting to look at the multiple ways that we educate folks. So there are the shorter terms that happen within multi-session semesters that you're going to hear from David as well. But the other thing is we host a Career Skills Academy. And these are shorter term credentials that you can get credit for prior learning when you come into the pathway that moves you to the higher levels of opportunity. These certificates, these credentials actually allow you to sit for certifying exams that then pay you, that start you in salaries making $45,000, $50,000. So really these middle skills opportunities. The challenge in this country is that these are not supported by federal dollars. So these are actually dollars that are coming out of the pockets of the participants. So when you heard poor people say, we think that there is some value in higher education, we'd love to get involved because we think it will make our lives better, but we are skittish about doing it because we can't afford it, it's because our current financial aid system does not provide for financial support for these kinds of opportunities that move people right into the world of work, that actually enable them to be earners in their community, supporting the growth of the community, and then allowing them to come back into the credit side that then moves them up the economic ladder. So this country has to make some investments with respect to federal support for all kinds of different educational experiences that enhance the viability of the nation. We have to think about how we're looking at education as a national priority, how we're going to look at the education of our people as part of what America needs now to move out of the economic uncertainty caused by this pandemic. What we need to move now is we're going to need to cut down this 10 million folks who are on a sort of unemployment now because of the higher unemployment rates that are going up, not it's about 40 million people, right? So unemployment is now at like 10%. So how do we begin to make inroads? Well, our government has to make investments. You have to put us in a position where we can help folks not only gain confidence and skills, but real opportunities.
Thank you. And Dr. Andrews, do you want to speak to national?
The value proposition is a great question, and I think one of the mistakes we make is assuming that everyone has the same goal. Again, I'll go back to the goal setting in coming to us, and we have a very heterogeneous group of students who come to us as undergraduates, graduates for multiple reasons. Most of them looking for a better job, but we do have students. I talked to students who just 2 months ago that said, look, I have teenagers. I've told them that going to college is important. I never finished my degree. I want a degree. I don't care what the discipline is. I just want to finish. So the value proposition for her is how fast can I do this and meet a requirement that leads to a bachelor's degree so that I say I have one. If we put her through the gauntlet of career exploration, we're not meeting her demands. On the other hand, we have engineers that come to us who want to be a Qualcomm engineer number 4, and so a basic degree in engineering is not fulfilling that value proposition either. They need very specific use of their electives and very specific internship experiences in order to fulfill their goal. But the first step is understanding that they have a goal. And documenting that within the system and then staying true to the value proposition for that student in a very personalized way. It takes a rethinking of a one-size-fits-all organization in order to get to that point.
I also add to that, I think one of the challenges we do face is this connection of how to help people translate their aptitude and interest into the world of work, right? So how do you understand what your prior learning is, what your competencies have been, and connect that to what you aspire to be, and really understand how to discern as a consumer what is the return on investment for one credential or degree over another. And so I do think that that is a gap that we really have got to address. Many of these things, as you know, were pre-COVID challenges. There's even more urgency about it now. And I want to also echo Dr. Baston's comment about education and training being America's challenge and America's opportunity. When we think about where we are right now in healthcare challenges, right? So you think about social determinants of health, more people have education and training, they're healthier, they're more likely to be have their insurance, to be paying taxes and doing those kinds of things. When we think about the pandemic itself, We know that our research institutions are in this fight in terms of vaccines and therapies. So whatever the challenge is in our country, a well-resourced and a well-focused higher education system can make a difference. We are a critical asset to a strong post-COVID recovery, but we have to make sure that we are doing what my colleagues have mentioned, focusing on how to get better so that everyone has an opportunity in this country, not just a few.
Jenna, if I could just add, that also means challenging current structures and rethinking. So that means maybe the academic transcript has to be rethought. And maybe that academic transcript has to be broadened so that you can capture some more of the most important ways in which we talk about what the student has learned and how it translates into new opportunities. So what that means is that we've got to challenge the systems and the structures that we've established, that we feel comfortable with, that we hold on to for dear life, and actually say, this country needs us we the folks in higher education, to also be flexible in our approach, that we can't create winner and loser students, that we actually have to be thinking about all of the things that we have held on to as must. The 16-week semester was a must. Having the summers off was a must. Well, guess what? Life has changed, not just because of COVID, but the way in which the consumers have an interest in the things that will be beneficial to them, as well as business and industry. So from my point of view, we've got to now start to actually poke at things that will make us uncomfortable within higher education.
Well, that brings me back to a question that Dr. Andrews kind of alluded to, but as we think about rethinking systems and the way that we're doing it, one of the questions we have from the audience, partly inspired by your comments, Dr. Baston, is it time to do away with credit hours and move to competency-based education? That's, of course, one sliver of this conversation, but we'd love to hear from you. And then Dr. Andrews, you started to touch on this a little bit, but perhaps you can share what you guys are thinking about it at National. But Dr. Baston?
Well, certainly you cannot limit all of our options. And I think that while I'm not saying get rid of the credit hour, what I am saying is that we need to begin to think more broadly about the system and the validation structures. We even have to think of the regional accreditors' roles in this. And sort of, we've got to stop making our educational institutions gatekeepers and really start making them gateways. And it can't just be about fancy language of inclusion and opportunity and reducing barriers. We have to actually analyze the various barriers that actually keep opportunities at bay. The academic transcript being one, the time to the Carnegie hours, all of those things have to be re-examined, in my opinion. As we hit the reset button in other industries, higher education is due in some large measure to some reset opportunities as well.
I think that's a great observation. And in many ways, I've said this openly, and gotten criticized, but Carnegie units are part of the enemy at this point to personalization. And they were set up to, if you look back historically, they were set up to standardize our understanding of what seat time meant in high schools, essentially, so that we could transition people into college with an understanding of what they've been exposed to from a time perspective. And now it's become such a standardized unit that anything under one unit, one credit hour is hard to value. And we have to be careful about how we disrupt the mobility of students across our institutions if we don't have a standardized way of thinking about credit hours. So is it going to be helpful or hurtful to the transition of skills and competencies from one institution to another? But that grain size of the accumulation of skills and knowledge, combined with the notion that we should measure how long somebody tried to learn something versus what they learned, really is pushing us towards deeper exploration of competency-based. And what's going to be flip the switch is what we refer to as competency-based hiring. As soon as employers actually start hiring based on competency credentials versus degrees, then you're going to see a mad scramble for all of us to meet their needs. But Right now, there's a lot of rhetoric around competency-based hiring, but in many disciplines, there's not employer-based commitment to that hiring. We're starting to see it in some of the larger companies, but when everyone starts wanting to see not only what you can do, your skills and knowledge as represented by a university transcript, but also the authentic assessment of that lies underneath it. So when you click on a badge, you actually see a work sample that helps an employer determine whether or not our validation of what somebody knows and can do is accurate. Then you're going to see a sea change. Until then, I think we're stuck with a credit hour, which is a time-based recording of how much time somebody spent trying to learn something.
Dr. Hunter-Reed, I'd like to, I know you probably want to jump in on this question. And similar, we received a question that I think really piggybacks on what you're talking about, Dr. Andrews. So the question here is, we've talked a little bit about the need for government to take action on the financial front to help newly credentialed learners. But the point here was, it also falls on industry to step away from academic elitism. Prior to COVID, businesses were leaving job openings open, waiting on elite applicants to fill a very needed skill. That means that businesses really need to be open to opportunities to credentialed applicants from a broad scope of institutions, not just elite institutions. Dr. Hunter-Reed, as you think about this across the state of Louisiana, what kinds of conversations are you having with employers as they think about not only the degree as a requirement for hiring, but also the institution or the academic program?
A very important point. I've had more conversation about it in Colorado than I have had in Louisiana. We had a roundtable conversation with companies to Dr. Andrews' very point, that I was making the point that, to accelerate this conversation of moving from the diploma as a proxy for learning to real conversations around competencies, business and industry needs to set an expectation and lead by example. What we find, certainly in four-year institutions, is that the bachelor's degree gets you through 2 hoops of the HR review, and then you can have a conversation. And so we really can't have a meaningful change if the bachelor's degree is still coded into the review from HR to get students through the first couple of hoops into potentially an interview. So I do think that this is an important conversation around how do you drive change? And what are the expectations? Because all of my colleagues are absolutely right. Right now, the diploma is a proxy for learning. It doesn't speak to the competencies and skills you have. And it doesn't allow us to say clearly and definitely around what a student can or cannot do when they're moving into their employment and moving up the ladder, hopefully, in their employment as well. So these are conversations that I think have to occur, and I want industry, business and industry, to be at the table in these conversations, because for so long we've heard people say, we can't, we have all these jobs open and no one to fill these jobs. And so you have sort of, look to the left, look to the right conversation around whose responsibility is it, the blame game. We have to move beyond that to really a solution, a student-focused, employer-focused conversation around opportunity and what does that look like. So those are the conversations that absolutely must occur if we are going to have meaningful change, and it's past time for us to move into meaningful change in higher education.
Dave, maybe we pivot back for a minute to the individual consumer. So as we're having this conversation, this is a multifaceted, it requires everyone to pay attention and to play a role. But Dave, I'm curious, you've spent a lot of time thinking about this question of value and what do individuals, when they reflect back on their education or they think about returning, what does value look like? What are you hearing from the American public?
Thanks, Jenna. And 3 remarkable leaders we're hearing discuss today about trying to make real changes at scale that are focused on individuals. I was struck yesterday as we talked in advance, Dr. Andrews talked about, what used to be the equity of gas money and commute time to get to campus is now the equity, as Dr. Hunter-Reed said, of broadband access. And, 2 weeks ago, we looked at that and found that actually it's urban residents and communities of color that feel reliable internet access and reliable computer access is more of a burden than rural residents. And so we've been so bounded by time and place. I'm just struck as we learned today in your discussion of, I don't go to the bank in the same time and place the way I did growing up. I have an app on my phone, and I don't, there are a lot of things we don't do in those physical boundaries of time and place. And when we think about individual consumers, it's remarkable how persistent the closer education and work are in that experience, whether that's the advice about what to study or the skills I learned are relevant to what I do at work, or the field of study, or even the degree. We see consumers with vocational and technical certificates and program completions. They rate the value of their education more like graduate and professional students do. Those are the two groups that are highest in their subjective appraisal of it was worth the cost and it makes me an attractive job candidate. And so you just think of what we learned from those applied opportunities. Now you see that in healthcare at an associate level or a bachelor's level. You don't see the same income lift for an education major who becomes a teacher, but you see their appraisal of it was worth the cost and it makes me an attractive job candidate. They're higher than our business majors and our computer science majors because they're pursuing an interest they have, an aptitude that they have security and predictability, and they're finding fulfillment. And so that as we listen to the interests of people and we connect that to the opportunities they're seeking, what a gateway, President Baston, we can be rather than gatekeepers. We look to education as the means to repair the disequities that exist in our society. And when that very investment we make in repairing and overcoming has disequities built into it, it's a double whammy. And so we've got to fix that. So I just so appreciate the comments you've been making focused on the individuals that we're thinking about serving.
Well, and a question that just popped up that I think piggybacks on that very nicely from Marcia Schmidt-Blaine here is, too many students come in not knowing what they want to do after they graduate. They come to higher ed knowing they want a better job, but often lack the knowledge of what positions are possible, what jobs are out there. I had no idea my job today was even a job. So the question here is, how should we better prepare learners to find their purpose and to make that connection? So I'd love to open that up to the group.
Yeah, I think we start earlier. We tend to start talking about your career choices towards the tail end of the experience in the university, and we've got to clarify early. And if your goal is to explore, then what period of time are you using to make those explorations? We don't have that. We've had career services as kind of a tail end operation within most institutions. And one of the things I find interesting about this very quickly, about this conversation, is that most of what we've been talking about has nothing to do with modality, online or face-to-face. It has to do with changes we should have been making before the pandemic, or we were in the middle of making before the pandemic. And modality fades away quickly once you get comfortable with whatever modality you're using to reach your students. These issues don't go away until we tackle them directly.
And I think you're seeing, particularly in the community college space, this commitment to what we call guided pathways, that we're trying to get students on a path, we're trying to make sure that they stay on the path, that they learn and that they transition in effective ways, that if they have a strong start, they can have a strong finish. And we have to, even as part of the intake process, we begin that process, as David outlined in his comments earlier, with doing that career assessment at the front end. Some institutions do it during the registration process before the first semester. Some people embed it in the first year experience. But the community colleges, many around the country, are now using guided pathways and using the sort of choice architecture redesign to help people figure out, what do I want to do? What are the opportunities? And also to look at it from the equitable perspective. So are we steering people poor people into programs that's going to keep them poor, as an example? Or are we making sure that there's a diversity of folks that are getting in these programs? If you're looking at academic programs where you don't have representation, multicultural representation, what are we doing specifically from an equitable perspective with boot camps, with other programs to change the outcome and trajectory of those people? Because we know if we can get people who are in low income folks into high paying opportunities, that's going to change not only the trajectory of their lives, but every generation connected to them. So it's really being intentional about the experience, not only of our students, but also of our employees.
I would say this is something that we have got to take on. We've got to take it on at scale. Certainly, if we have students coming to our community colleges, we have to have a process, as these gentlemen have mentioned, on the front end to help. I'm also wanting to make sure that work-based learning experiences happen in our K-12 system so that students get that experience. They understand how to navigate. They understand how to match their aptitude and interest to employment opportunities as early as possible. Because you're absolutely right. What we know about low-income kids is if you say to them, what do you want to be? Their answer 9 times out of 10 is relationship driven. My uncle is this, my mom is that, so that's what I'm going to be. It's not connected to their aptitude and their interest. They don't understand how to monetize their passion. They don't understand the arc of the possible. And so it's our job to make sure that we have more opportunity for students to navigate, to network, to understand the opportunities that are available to them. And so that is an important question, an important deficit, I think, in our model that we have to address.
Thank you for that, Dr. Hunter-Reed, and thank you, all 3 of you, for joining us. I'm mindful of time. This has been a great discussion. We'll continue to have these discussions. Public Viewpoints is continuing to look into these issues and to follow this as we go into the fall. So you'll hear more from us. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another discussion. You'll also hear from the Strata team, for those of you joining us, welcoming your input too. We'd love feedback on the topics and what else we should continue to explore. So definitely be on the lookout for that tomorrow. But thank you all, Dr. Andrews, Dr. Kim Hunter-Reed, Dr. Bastan, Dave, thank you. Really appreciate the conversation and look forward to the next time.
Thank you.
Great to be with you. We appreciate it.
Take care.